Welcome, everybody. My name's Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to this year's Berkley Center lecture with our own José Casanova on the topic, The Church in the World, Secular Morality, and the Challenge of Gender. In a moment, I will introduce President DeGioia, who will introduce José. But first, just a short word about our work at the center. We were created some 6 years ago as part of a university-wide initiative to advance the interdisciplinary study of religion as it intersects with global challenges of democracy, development, diplomacy, and dialogue. We've since assembled a top-flight faculty, developed a range of teaching and research programs and partnerships, and work with other units on campus to strengthen Georgetown's position as a leading global university. I'm going to resist the temptation to go into more detail about all our work. I will say that one of the topics we focused on from the outset is what will engage us this evening, the changing role of the church in the world. It's a perennial issue, of course, but one that is particularly relevant on the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council, which we commemorated just a couple of weeks ago at a wonderful conference. José, we look forward to your reflections on the church, the world, and the challenge of gender. We're delighted that you're part of our center and our wider community. I'm especially delighted that Ika is with us this evening as well. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce President John J. DeGioia, who has served as the 48th president of Georgetown since 2001, and before that, for more than 2 decades, in a range of other leadership positions across our university. Over the past decade under President DeGioia, Georgetown has emerged as a global force in higher education and as an innovator in efforts to link up our core mission of teaching and research with service to the wider world. Examples include our campus in Doha, Qatar, our outreach to China, and our support for A Common Word, the leading global forum for Muslim-Christian dialogue. Dr. DeGioia addresses broader issues in higher education as chair of the board of directors of the Forum for the Future of Higher Education, and as a member of the board of directors for the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities, among many other leadership roles that link our great university with the wider world. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming President Jack DeGioia.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Thank you both for that kind introduction and for your leadership of our Berkley Center. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you this evening and to welcome you here to Riggs Library. I know so many familiar faces here tonight, but for those who may be here for the first time, this beautiful space dates back to the late 1890s when its first books were placed on these very shelves surrounding us today. And since then, this has been a place of learning, of scholarship, a place where generations of our community have gathered to study and engage in dialogue to pursue as a university greater knowledge and understanding. And we gather this evening for another Berkley Center lecture, a series which allows us to deepen our understanding of religion, our secular culture, and our global family. In 2007, we heard from Tariq Ramadan on Muslim-Christian relations. In 2008, Charles Taylor shared his thoughts on the master narratives of modernity and their relation to secularization. In 2009, Hans Joas delivered a series of lectures on universal human rights. And just last fall, Jürgen Habermas spoke to us about ritual nationalism and religious arguments in the public sphere. Today, we will continue our examination of the religious and secular dimensions of our world with an eminent scholar, a member of our Georgetown family, Dr. José Casanova, a Berkley Center senior fellow, a professor in our Department of Sociology, and leads the Berkley Center's program on globalization, religion, and the secular, as well as its new project on the Jesuits and globalization. Before joining our faculty in 2008, he had a distinguished 20-year career at the New School for Social Research and has held a range of visiting positions at institutions ranging from Columbia University to the Free University of Berlin. His contributions to his profession are significant in both their depth and breadth. He has published works on a wide range of subjects, including religion and globalization, migration and religious pluralism, transnational religions, and sociological theory. His best-known work, Public Religions in the Modern World, has become a modern classic in the field and has been translated into five languages, including Arabic and Indonesian. Through a masterful combination of both theory and empirical evidence, this book provides us with a new framework for understanding the global resurgence of religious engagement and its impact on secular culture. My colleagues in the back, if you want to come in, we got a whole bunch of seats in the front row, so I know that's always a little embarrassing and all that, but I can't see who any of them are because the lights are too bright, so I don't know whether I have some explaining to do when I leave here tonight. Through a masterful, the recent research of Dr. Casanova has focused on globalization in religion, namely the dynamics of transnational religion, migration, and of the world's increasing ethno-religious and cultural diversity. In recognition of this exceptional work, José was awarded the Salzburg Theological Prize in August in honor of his lifelong achievement in the field of theology. Today he will deliver a lecture on the church and the world, secular morality and the challenge of gender, and a look upon the legacy of the Second Vatican Council, which marked an historic shift in the way that the church engages with its internal family and with secular culture. Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, one of four apostolic constitutions to emerge from Vatican II, proclaimed the church's responsibilities to society as rooted in Catholic teachings. It advocated a more explicit and active role for the church and its people in spheres that had been viewed traditionally as separate and secular: economic justice, social justice, culture, science, technology, ecumenism. And similarly, through the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom, or Dignitatis Humanae, the Church engaged with secular culture more directly by affirming, quote, the inviolable rights of the human person and the constitutional order of society. As a result, during the last half-century, the Church has become increasingly engaged in dialogue with our secular culture on questions of morality and on issues of rights and justice. This legacy of Vatican II provides the context for Dr. Casanova's remarks today on the church, secular morality, and issues relating to gender. He will offer an analysis of the mounting questions that the church faces regarding women's equality, both within its own ranks and throughout secular culture. We look forward to his insights and his thoughts on this topic, as well as to the dialogue it will no doubt inspire. Again, we are so pleased that each of you are here and could join us for this event this evening, and it's now my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. José Casanova.
Good evening. Thank you very much, President DeGioia and also Tam. This was the place which I had my job talk when I was considering coming to Georgetown. And the reason why I even considered leaving New York and leaving the new school after being there for 20 years was both of you. So it was a great decision that I made, and I'm very thankful to both of you for that. The lecture I am presenting today is a version of the lecture I delivered precisely in Salzburg upon reception of the Theological Prize, something which it was unexpected because I'm not a theologian. I'm not a theologian, indeed. I'm a sociologist who has been deeply concerned for some time by the perception of an increasingly, and in my view, dangerous, disjunction between societal morality and church morality and issues of gender and sexual mores. This disjunction is problematic for both, for secular morality as well as for church morality. Today, I must restrict myself to address the dangers which such a disjunction entails for the future of the Church. Obviously, the disjunction is equally problematic for developments in secular morality, particularly when the voice of the Church is not being heard precisely due to a crisis of legitimacy originating in such a disjunction. I do not claim any theological competence in these matters, but I hope that my critical sociological reflection can be of help for new theological reflection within the Church. The relationship between societal and church morality throughout the history of Christianity has been a complex and mutually reciprocal one. In a somewhat simplified formulation, one could argue that roughly from the time of the Constantinian establishment, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, till the 18th century, the predominant direction of influence was marked by attempts of the Church to Christianize the seculum, that is, to make secular society and the people living in it Christian. Charles Taylor has offered us one of the most persuasive accounts of the diverse and recurrent movements of Christian reform which have contributed to, in manifold ways, to the emergence of our secular age. But one could argue that, at least since the 18th century, the direction of influence has been reversed, and that increasingly modern secular societal morality has been the one challenging, informing, and influencing church morality. Using again a shorthand formulation, one may say that the key moral principles governing modern societal morality have been the self-evident truths, which were formulated most succinctly by the American Revolution, that all men, and we would add today all women, are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. One could, of course, legitimately argue that, as was obvious to the Founding Fathers, these modern secular moral principles were in manifold ways related to Christian moral principles. But as the intended and unintended consequences of these moral principles have unfolded, and as they found ever greater institutionalization in the various realms of modern societies, the Catholic Church often found itself on the defensive, frequently resisting at first these novel moral developments, then grudgingly accommodating to them, and then finally embracing them as principles grounded in Christian revelation. The relative tardiness of the Catholic Church in embracing the modern moral crusade of abolition of slavery, and the even more prolonged tardiness in embracing modern individual human rights, most particularly the right of religious freedom, as being grounded in the sacred dignity of the human person, can serve as paradigmatic illustrations of the disjunction between evolving secular morality and resisting church morality, and of the resulting typical dynamics of aggiornamento, of catching up, and of discerning theologically the signs of the times which accompany this disjunction. Already in the middle of the 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville articulated most poignantly the providential and irresistible moral political force of the modern principle of equality of conditions. The imagined egalitarian moral community has been constantly expanding to include within its circle ever larger categories of human persons of equal dignity and respect. At first, bourgeois, adult, white males only, then progressively workers and lower classes, women, other races, and non-Western people enslaved and colonized by European Christians, and so on. Presently, the moral principles of life, liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness are converging most dramatically throughout the world around issues of gender equality and sexual morality. While the principle that all men and women are created equal is becoming an ever more self-evident truth, the task of somehow bridging the enormous gap between the norm of gender equality and the appalling reality of unequal worth unequal status, and unequal access to resources and power, which women suffer throughout the world, is likely to remain one of the most important historical political tasks and challenges for all societies and all institutions, including religious ones. The gender question is in many respects the fundamental moral question of our times, in the same way as the social question was the fundamental moral question from the middle of the 19th century. The Catholic Church, pressed by Catholic dynamics emerging from the grassroots of social Catholic movements, has a commendable record of addressing the social question. But when it comes to the gender question, our church, at least our hierarchy and the magisterium, have mainly failed to address theologically the new challenge, contenting itself with reaffirming traditional teachings which fail to come to terms with the radical social transformation and with the signs of the times. The stillbirth of the 1988 first draft of the pastoral letter of the US bishops, Partners in the Mystery of Redemption, a pastoral response to women's concerns for church and society, offers a reproof of the failure of our church hierarchy to responsibly face the issue. From the grassroots consultation with approximately 75,000 Catholic women in 100 dioceses, the committee in charge of drafting the document had chosen to discuss the concerns under 4 headings: women as persons, women in relationships, women in society, and women in the church. All the issues, but particularly women in the church, have been shelved indefinitely and removed from open public discussion within the church. But the gender question will not go away. On the contrary, it has only become more urgent. I would like to address what, from a sociological perspective, must be viewed as a growing disjunction between societal and church morality by reference to 3 morally contested issues: the role of women in the church, with particular reference to the ordination of women, the official pronouncements of the church hierarchy on issues of gender and sexual morality, and the societal moral outrage produced by the clerical sexual abuse of children. First, the ordination of women and equal gender access to positions of power, authority, and status within the church. While ecclesiologically, the church is to be viewed and apprehended in faith as a sacramental eschatological sign of the kingdom of God, sociologically as a socio-historical institution in the saeculum, the Catholic Church, like any other religious institution can be conceptualized as a religious regime that belongs to the city of man and is analogous in many respects to polities and economies. In both cases, the obvious question is the extent to which the system of power relations and the social relations are gender and unequal. As a universally salvation religion, Christianity has always offered equal access to salvation and to holiness to male and female. There is no gender discrimination in the eyes of God. As loving Father, God expresses a preferential option for the weak, the poor, the meek, the orphan, the widow. This is the core prophetic ethical norm that anticipates modern gender equality as a transcendent principle. Neither Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female. But sociologically, the Catholic Church is characterized by a dual system of highly differentiated and canonically regulated religious roles. There is, first of all, the sacramental differentiation between ordained priesthood and laity. Additionally, there is a differentiation between, on the one hand, the religious orders, male and female, which follow the evangelical councils, and on the other hand, the secular Christians, including the secular clergy, who live in the world. The existence of male and female religious orders and the high number of female saints, particularly in the early church, confirm that there is indeed ungendered universal access to religious salvation within the ecclesia invisibilis, that is, within the communion of the saints. However, within the Catholic Church, as ecclesia visibilis, both as public assembly and as a hierarchically and bureaucratically organized episcopal church, the crucial differentiation is that between clergy and laity. Priesthood as the site of sacerdotal, sacramental, magisterial, and administrative canonical authority is exclusively reserved for males. This is the fundamental issue of patriarchal gender discrimination within a male clerical church. The official response of the Catholic male hierarchy to the modern demand for female ordination has been that ordination is of divine origin and therefore unchangeable, since Jesus selected only males as his disciples, who are the links to the apostolic succession of episcopal male priesthood. The hierarchy insists that it has no authority whatsoever to change this divine injunction, and in his 1994 apostolic letter, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, Pope John Paul II attempted to preclude any discussion of this issue in the future by stating that this judgment is to be definitively held by all the Church's faithful. The reference to Jesus' selection of male disciples might be a persuasive sociocultural argument of historical precedent in accordance with the cultural patriarchal premises of the apostolic age, but it is not a very well-grounded theological argument with scriptural support. Indeed, the male character of the priesthood was such taken for granted cultural premise throughout the history of the Church, so much part of social doxa, or what Taylor calls the unthought, that it was unnecessary to provide a serious theological justification for it. Only after the modern democratic revolution put into question any form of gender discrimination has been a theological justification required. The justifications offered so far in the 1976 Declaration Inter Insignores under Pope Paul VI and in Ordinatio Sacerdotalis are extremely thin, just one page, in size, and light in theological argumentation. Moreover, even if some theological consensus may persist still for some time that women should be excluded from the sacerdotal sacramental function, there will be greater difficulty in providing persuasive theological and moral rationales for excluding women, particularly women religious, from greater administrative power within the Church, including the Curia and the College of Cardinals. After all, if historical precedent is a relevant argument, originally the Roman College of Cardinals was open to the laity, and there is no serious theological reason why the College of Cardinals, as well as ministerial positions within the Curia, could not be open today to the female laity, or at least to female religious orders. Moreover, if some women, such as Santa Teresa de Avila, and most recently Saint Hildegard of Bingen, are elevated to the titles of doctors of the Church posthumously, why preclude that women may play a role in the magisterium of the Church while they are alive? But this does not appear to be the direction in which our church hierarchy is heading. On the contrary, the recent doctrinal assessment of the U.S. Leadership Conference of Women Religious, issued by the Vatican Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith on April 18, 2012, and the decision to place the LCWR under the disciplinary supervision of 3 U.S. bishops, indicate that the thrust is to restrict even further the limited autonomy of female religious orders and to bring them under greater male clerical control. Striking was the fact that the Vatican condemnation and the sanctions were not directed at the specific individuals who may have challenged specific church doctrines, nor at concrete questionable doctrinal positions formally embraced by LCWR, but rather it was a blanket rebuke for sins of omission of an entire organization of 1,500 nuns who are leaders of more than 300 religious orders, representing circa 57,000 religious sisters and comprising approximately 80% of all female religious in the United States. Second, the hierarchy's inadequate response to the modern sexual revolution and to the evolving gender and sexual morality. The radical change in circumstances produced by the modern democratic and sexual revolutions and the fundamental transformations in gender relations and gender roles, which both entail, present a particularly difficult challenge to the sacred claims of all religious traditions. Not surprisingly, the politics of gender and gender equality are central to politics everywhere today, and religion is thoroughly and intimately implicated in the politics of gender. Indeed, many analysts have been tempted to interpret what they view as the global emergence of religious fundamentalism in all religious traditions as primarily a patriarchal reaction against the common global threat of gender equality, the emancipation of women, and feminism. Feminism appears to have replaced communism as the specter haunting all religious traditions. In turn, the discourses of feminism and secularism have become intertwined today in the same way as communism and atheism became intertwined in the 19th century. Gender has become, in this respect, the preeminently contested social question, while religion has been thrown willingly or unwillingly into the vortex of the global contestation. Traditional religious establishments tend to view feminist agendas, and particularly the very notion of gender, as a historically contingent, socially constructed, and therefore changeable reality as the greatest threat not only to their religious traditions and their moral authoritative claims, but to the very idea of a sacred or divinely ordained natural order inscribed either in natural law, Sharia, or some right way, universally valid for all times. At the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church embraced theological developmental principles grounded in the historicity of divine revelation, incarnation, and continuous historical unfolding of the divine plans of salvation for humanity that require the Church's careful discernment of the signs of the times. The Catholic Aggiornamento represented in this respect recognition of the fundamental moral principles of secular modernity. The human dignity of each and every person emerges as the guiding principle of the three most consequential documents of Vatican II: the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, the Declaration on Religious Freedom, Dignitatis Humanae, and the Declaration on the Relationship of the Church to non-Christian religions, Nostra Aetate. All three documents share, moreover, the explicit reference to the signs of the times and the historicist recognition that we are entering a new age in the history of humanity with important repercussions for our understanding of the unfolding of the mystery of salvation. Actually, the same historicist and developmental recognition appears most poignantly in the section directed to women in the closing speech of the Council, when the Council Fathers asserted that, quote, at this moment when the human race is undergoing so deep a transformation, the hour is coming, in fact, has come, when the vocation of woman is being achieved in its fullness, the hour in which woman acquires in the world an influence, an effect, and a power never hitherto achieved. Yet, this prophetic vision of the unprecedented transformation in gender relations which humanity was experiencing did not have the transformative consequences one should have expected in the life of the Church after the Council. Indeed, on issues of gender and sexual moral theology, the Catholic hierarchy, since the publication of the encyclical Humanae Vitae in 1968, has reasserted a traditionalist ontological conception of human nature and of human biology based on the essentialist conception of an ahistorical, unchanging, and universally valid natural law. Such a traditional ontological conception is increasingly in tension with the historicist conception of human moral development upheld by the social sciences, as well as with the conception of a changing biological historical nature informed by the new evolutionary life sciences. Confronted with the radical character of the gender and sexual revolution of the late 60s, the post-conciliar Church seemed to be backpedaling and abandoning the historicist, prophetic, and forward-looking discernment of the signs of the times, reverting to the defense of an unchanging and unchangeable tradition grounded in eternal and divine natural law. I want to make clear that the historicist principle of aggiornamento and a critical prophetic discernment of the signs of the times do not need to imply at all an uncritical accommodation to modern secular liberal culture or to historical progress. Not every change is for the better, and there are many signs of the times, particularly in high divorce rates, teenage pregnancy, abortion, pornography, the commodification and debasement of the female body and of human sexuality in general, which are negative violations of human dignity that many social scientists also recognize as anomic. But the Church can only maintain a critical, indeed prophetic, relationship to secular culture if it can differentiate its eschatological principles from their irremediable historical embeddedness, in particular traditional historical cultures. Eschatologically, the body of Christ and the city of God may always be in tension with any societal culture and with the city of man. But this tension will prove historically unsustainable if it is simply derived from an uncritical defense of a traditional form of societal culture which appears resistant to moral historical development. The issue here is not one of moral relativism as a matter of arbitrary individual choice or preference, but that of the clash between fundamental sacred moral values. Theologically, any religious community has the right and the duty to uphold what it considers a divinely ordained sacred injunction or moral norm. Sociologically, however, the question is how long any religious tradition, particularly a Catholic one, which claims to be the church of all, can resist the adoption of a new moral value when a near universal consensus concerning the sacred character of such a value emerges in society. To the degree modern moral developments as a reversion to paganism or a rampant relativism is to misunderstand much of modern historical development. The modern sacralization of human rights is a case in point. The Catholic affirmation and missionary embrace of modern human rights, such as the inalienable right to religious freedom, grounded in the sacred dignity of the human person, after having been repeatedly condemned by various popes as anathema, should serve as ground for some theological and moral caution. Humbly, the Catholic Church has admitted publicly to have committed grave moral errors in the past and these and on many other issues. Sociologically, in reaction to the Catholic Church's official defense of a traditionalist position on gender issues, and a singularly obsessive focus on sexual moral issues, one can observe throughout the Catholic world a dual process of female secularization and erosion of the Church's authority and sexual morality. Perhaps for the first time, in the accumulative waves of modern secularization, women have left the Church in large numbers, most dramatically throughout Europe, but increasingly also throughout North America, and incipiently, but very, very significantly, in Latin America, in a way that should sound alarm bells. Female secularization is probably the most significant factor in the drastic secularization of Western European societies since the 1960s, and in the radical rupture of European Christian religion as a chain of memory. The male intelligentsia left the Church in the 18th century, the male bourgeoisie in the early 19th century, and the male proletariat in the late 19th and 20th century. But as long as women remained in the Church, children were baptized and raised as Christians, and there was a future for the Church and the possibility of a religious revival and a reversal of secularization. Once women begin to abandon massively the Church, as has happened and continues to happen since the 1960s, the future of the Church begins to look sociologically much bleaker. Equally crucial and of grave societal relevance is, in my view, the drastic secularization of sexual morality. Increasing numbers of practicing Catholics are disobeying the injunctions of the Catholic hierarchy and following their own conscience on most issues related to sexual morality. Moreover, there is increasing evidence from public opinion polls in Europe, North America, and Latin America that young Catholic adults are explicitly dissociating their sexuality and their religiosity, claiming that religion has absolutely no influence upon their attitudes towards sexuality. We are witnessing, on the one hand, a church hierarchy which evinces an almost obsessive focus in defending traditional sexual morality, and on the other hand, a majority of Catholic faithful in the secular world who not only ignore the moral injunctions of the hierarchy, but feel increasingly comfortable dissociating their religion and their sexuality. One must wonder how far this radical dissociation of private sexuality from religion and even from morality can go and where it may lead. In my view, it is leading to a radical secularization of the private sphere of individual consciousness that parallels the secularization of economics in the 18th century and of politics in the public sphere in the 19th century. In my judgment, the uncritical defense of traditional sexual mores and a wholesale critique of the modern sexual revolution in the name of natural law principles, one that fails to recognize the providential sign of the times in modern secular moral developments, grounded in the sacred dignity of the human person, will be counterproductive and will not be able to play a critical prophetic role vis-à-vis some of the most questionable trends. Only a church that recognizes and embraces the validity of the core modern moral developments as part of the providential signs of the times can play a critical prophetic role vis-à-vis immoral and anomic secular trends. Finally, the scandalon of the clerical sexual abuse of children. Perhaps in no other area has the gap between societal and church morality been more publicly visible than in the revelations of clerical child sexual abuse that have racked so dramatically the Catholic Church, country after country, in recent years. The scandal has taken everywhere the same threefold form. First, there was the initial shock and the scandal at the public revelation of the clerical sexual abuse of children. Then there followed the even greater shock and a scandal at the revelation of the widespread and persistent episcopal and curial praxis of cover-up. Then there follow the dismay at the totally inappropriate character of so many public statements and rationales offered by Episcopal and Vatican authorities. The Church, of course, has always considered child sexual abuse a grave moral sin, but it has shown difficulties understanding the extent to which child sexual abuse is not just a grave moral offense, but has become a sacrilegious moral and legal crime, precisely in supposedly sexually freewheeling and licentious contemporary societies. The Canadian moral theologian Daniel Sear has captured most poignantly the emerging gap in societal and church morality. The Catholic Church appears to be caught in a deadly cultural crossfire. The Church is widely mocked for its attempt to resist the ongoing liberalization of sexuality. At the same time, the Church has become the focus for intense public outrage insofar as it is perceived to be the showcase for the one form of sexual transgression that contemporary culture, with all its freewheeling sexual transgressiveness, decisively condemns as beyond the moral pale. Nothing, perhaps, reveals as clearly the gap between societal and church morality than the fact that it has taken the church so long to understand that child sexual abuse, which was a relatively widespread but ignored practice in the past across societies and institutions, has become a modern societal taboo, and that modern societies have learned to react with the same scandalous shock and with a kind of moral outrage which, according to Durkheim, is the typical societal response to the sacrilegious profanation of any taboo. It was secular society and public opinion that were ahead of the church on this moral issue, while the church appeared to be lagging behind and dragging its feet. Fortunately, the papacy of Benedict XVI put an end to the ambiguities of the Vatican's response and initiated a new policy of zero tolerance towards abuse in priests, full collaboration with civil authorities in the investigation of any criminal allegation, repeated gestures of contrition and public supplication of forgiveness for the clerical wrongdoing and for the serious harm caused to the victims, and personal encounters and open dialogue with the victims and their families. There are solid grounds for hope that the worst of the scandal may be behind us. But what are the moral lessons which the Church appears to have drawn from the disastrous historical episode? One important, but in my view insufficient, lesson appears to be that the Church, being in the world, was caught up, like everybody else, and like all worldly institutions, in the whirlwind of the sexual revolution, the countercultural experiments, and the general anomic attitudes and deviant behavior that became seemingly endemic in liberal Western societies in the 1960s and the 1970s. This appears to be the selective lesson reinforced by the two reports presented to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops by the research team of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. The findings are very relevant and demonstrate that the phenomenon of clerical sexual abuse was indeed a historical episode in that there was a drastic and persistent increase in the number of incidents of sexual abuse of minors from the early 60s to the late 70s, which was uniform across all dioceses and regions in the United States, and was followed by an equally precipitous, consistent, and uniform decline from the early 80s to the early 90s. Paradoxically, revelations of the abuse only began to appear slowly in the early 1980s, 2 decades after the endemic abuse had begun, and at a time when the decline was already well underway. The church hierarchy appeared to be relieved by the conclusive findings of the reports that, contrary to widespread public opinion, there was no demonstrable correlation between clerical sexual abuse and the priestly rule of celibacy, nor any clear, unambiguous correlation between the noted homosexual tendencies among candidates to the priesthood and the sexual abuse of children, since the homosexual tendencies in seminaries increased significantly in the 1990s, while the rate of abuse continued to decline throughout the decade and remained persistently low into the first decade of the 21st century. The report findings seem to confirm the impression that the causes of the epidemic were social and external rather than internal to the church, a clear case of secular moral degeneration contaminating some rotten apples within the church. The lesson which the church appears to have drawn heartily from the scandal is the need for greater vigilance, reforming its seminaries, putting even a stricter emphasis on the doctrine of celibacy and on the separation and protection of seminarians and priests from corrupting secular immoral influences. The model appears to be increasingly that of a pure clerical church in an impure secular world. The lesson could have been different if the reports and the ecclesiastical reading of the findings had paid greater attention to the obvious fact that the decline of the clerical sexual abuse was equally due to social causes that were external rather than internal to the church, since the decline started and continued uninterruptedly well before the church began to respond to the crisis, instituting its own internal reforms. The single most important cause in the sudden and rapid decline of clerical sexual abuse was a change in secular societal morality that led to the criminalization of the sexual abuse of women and children. The practice, which now began to be viewed as aberrant, had been hitherto widespread, ignored, and concealed in most social settings. The main carriers of this secular moral revolution were women and feminists who made society morally aware that the widespread sexual abuse of women at home, at work, and in public places was morally unacceptable and could not continue with impunity. The elevation of the sacred dignity of children and their protection from adult, predominantly male sexual abuse was primarily also the moral consequence of the same feminist movement, which helped to raise the sacred dignity of women. In my humble sociological view, it behooves the Church to discern carefully the providential signs of the times in such secular moral developments. After all, feminism might not be the main problem facing the Church. On the contrary, a proper response to the feminist challenge may in fact be a solution to many of the contemporary problems facing the Church. But the world and the faithful are still waiting for a serious institutional and theological response on the part of the hierarchy and the magisterium to Pope John Paul II's own call for a new feminism in his 1995 encyclical Evangelium Vitae. It is true that celibacy is not to blame for the abuse, but clericalism was certainly part of the problem and was to a large extent the reason for the inadequate response. Moreover, the reinforced male clericalism we are witnessing is most surely not the appropriate response to the problem. The long-term solution can only come from greater clerical transparency, greater openness to the laity, and greater authority and responsibility of the female religious within the Church. A problematic trend within the Church today is the growing clericalization of diocesan priests who are becoming increasingly detached from the laity and from the world, while the male and female religious orders are becoming ever more incarnated in the world. This entails a paradoxical reversal. The diocesan secular clergy is becoming ever more religious and detached from the world, while the male and female religious are becoming ever more engaged in the secular world. The religious orders remain today one of the rare places within the Church for relative autonomy from episcopal supervision and control. Understandably, given the increasing trend towards centralized, hierarchic and clerical authority within the Church, the Vatican and the episcopate tend to view the autonomy of the religious orders with a certain apprehension and would like to curtail their autonomy. The discipline of the LCWR, along with the attempt to discipline Catholic universities run by religious orders, are apparent gestures in this direction. Yet the crackdown on female religious who question the official position of the hierarchy on issues of gender equality and sexual morality is, in my view, not the appropriate response. It might reassert internal discipline in the short term, but it is unlikely to solve the crisis of moral authority of the hierarchy in the long run, and it is likely to lead to increasing female alienation from the Church. Bemoaning the break of trust between the Vatican and the LCWR, President Sister Pat Farrell told the National Catholic Register, "We have different perspectives about the Church and our role in the Church and the role of the laity in the Church. We have never considered ourselves in any way unfaithful to the Church. But if questioning is interpreted as defiance, that puts us in a very difficult position. Ultimately, what is at stake is the room for faithful dissent within the Church. In the same way as modern democratic societies have to accommodate the principle of civil disobedience, the Catholic Church in the modern world will need to accommodate the principle of faithful dissent within its ranks and also be more open to its internal pluralism. We, the laity, have a special obligation to assume our responsibility as people of God and to respond to the growing clericalism within the Church, faithfully yet assertively expressing our dissent when called forth. In Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the Church, the Council Fathers affirm, the laity are, by reason of the knowledge, competence, or outstanding ability which they may enjoy, permitted and sometimes even obliged to express their opinion on these things which concern the good of the Church. This lecture has been my humble response to this calling, the faithful dissent of a Catholic sociologist's concern about the growing disjunction between societal and church morality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose. You covered a lot of ground in just 45 minutes and raised a lot of issues that have been with us and will be with us for decades to come. We're a bit constrained in the Q&A period. Good news, bad news. The good news is that we have a reception waiting outside where we can have more informal conversation and you can ask follow-up questions. The bad news is we've only got about 15 more minutes in this room for a more formal exchange. So let's make the most of that. And
Have you gather questions?
Yeah, let's gather three questions, and because of the time constraint, 3 at a time. We'll see if we can get through a few series. I'd ask you to be brief, don't make a statement, pose a question, and also identify yourself briefly. We have a couple of mics. Let's start here and here and here. Please stand up.
Thank you. I'm Sister Janet Gottschalk of the Medical Mission Sisters. Former member of LCWR, and I just want to thank you so very, 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 very much for what you have said tonight. My own religious community has struggled with the Vatican over women being doctors of many, 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 many things. So this is just one more step along the journey. But I mean, your talk gives me incredible hope. I am one of those women who really is incredibly alienated from the church as it is today. Thank you.
Thank you. Chet?
Chester Gillis, and I am a theologian. One comment and then a question.
My
as
dean.
also.
Also.
The comment is, that, sociological evidence recently bears out what you said about women. There's a new book coming out, American Catholics, Bill D'Antonio and Mary Gautier, which shows that the surveys say women in the 1980s said 80% of them were deeply attached to the church, and today it's trending toward 50%, which will have terrible deleterious effects, sadly, I think. But my question is, you're a sociologist. Do you think the church will listen to you?
All right. We'll gather another question while you think about that one. Right here, third question. Yeah.
Hello, Stephen Baskerville from Patrick Henry College. Sorry, but someone has to put in a word of dissent here and forgive the expression, the devil's advocate. Today, in the name of gender equality, our society is facing huge problems, some of which you outlined. Single-parent homes, the breakdown of the family, criminality, the bloated welfare state. And one that's come on the fore especially is the threat to religious freedom, which I understand the Berkley Center is part of their mission. Virtually all of the threats to religious freedom in the Western world today, almost all of them, come in the name of sexual freedom. I would have expected a little more from the Berkley Center, frankly, on these questions about the clash, which is coming increasingly looking to be eyeball to eyeball, between sexual freedom and religious freedom.
Thank you. Jose?
Well, to the sister, I mean, you've given me the courage to speak. Your work, you've been, you have to be admired for what you've done under really pressure, non-recognition, and almost harassment. So we thank you, and don't lose hope. The second question,
Chet.
yes. Will the church listen to me? The only reason why I'm speaking now is because they've listened to my critique of secularism. My last 20 years have been dedicated to question the secularist self-understandings of modernity. And they very much like this critique, and they use my work. And so when I was given a theological prize for it, I said, and the topic of the Hochschulwochen in Salzburg was Verantworten. I saw as a providential call to take my responsibility to answer precisely what can I do as a sociologist to reflect upon the church. And this leads me to the next question. As I said, today I was only going to restrict myself to the dangers which this disjunction between secular and church morality brings for the church. But it has exactly the same disastrous consequences, in my view. That's why I speak about the secularization of sexual morality and what does it imply for societies. But fortunately, I would say, I'm not only an American. I think we should avoid having a view of the world from our polarized debate on these issues. I mean, the European debate is rather different on many of these issues. And I certainly wouldn't argue that the threats to religious freedom everywhere are related to this. I mean, again, this is something which I've been working for 20 years, before a lot of people that now come to the defense of religious freedom. And I think that we have to be very careful to link now or to go back to libertas ecclesiae as a fundamental principle and abandon what was the great theological, what made possible the very document of Dignitatis Humanis. We know from the great John Kearney Murray, the theologian, he wrote the rationale how from libertas ecclesiae to libertas personae.
Explain that, libertas ecclesiae.
Well, libertas ecclesiae was the argument that the church has taken in its relationships to the states, the need to protect the right of the church to basically be mater et magistra. And it came a moment in which the church realized that the best way of doing it was through the defense of the religious freedom of every individual. And my point is that to go back now to turn the principle of religious freedom back to the corporatist principle of libertas ecclesiae, for me is a very problematic development. I think that those are very, very, my argument here, again, that's why I did not raise any a specific comment on homosexuality, on contraception, on abortion. Those are very, very controversial topics. All of them have to be discussed. My point is we need within the Catholic Church to have serious theological open reflection on these matters that precisely prepares the ground for the eventual new theological consensus that emerges within the Church. The Vatican Council would not have happened, and the documents, if 20 years before, theologians had not spent a lot of time discussing these kind of things within their theological work. But when now the Church tells their theologians, you cannot discuss those issues, those are beyond debate. No, we need to debate them very seriously. But we can only really come to some consensus if we really can have serious theological reflection on those issues. And I don't see them on the part of the hierarchy or on the part of the political polarization in this country.
Okay, let's gather 3 more questions. Any students like to pose a question? I'm going to wait until a student raises his hand. Is that right over here? Okay.
Hi, I'm Teddy Weiss. I'm a graduate student
Please
here.
stand up. Yeah.
I'm a graduate student. I guess, wouldn't the church argue that it's a slippery slope? I agree with you. I should preface that. I agree with you. But wouldn't the church argue that it's a slippery slope to all those other issues, and that's why they sort of shut the door before that even opens?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's get a couple more. Further questions? Well, we already heard from you. Let's try to get a couple new ones in the back. There's a hand back there. Yeah.
Liz Kennedy, I'm a 2007 graduate. What I see is that when you talk about secularism versus the church, they're 2 different languages. The word feminist in many conservative Catholic circles is a dirty word. How would you suggest translating these ideas in ways that defenders of these traditional ways of thinking would find more persuadable? They'd be more persuaded by those ideas. To me, they're 2 different languages. How do you translate?
Okay. Final question. Over here, Dan.
Jose, thank you. Dan Madigan from the Department of Theology. Why do you think it is that there is such a difference between the 2 sides of the Atlantic on these questions of the relation of church and state? The way things work in Italy, for example, in church attitudes to politicians and abortion, healthcare issues and contraception, as distinct from the very polarized situation here.
Again, each of these questions will take a whole lecture. The slippery slope, yes. It's a slippery slope. What I'm arguing is the need to a certain extent, reassert the historicist principle. Sign of the times is a very, very dangerous thing to do. It's like weather prediction and meteorology. It's not a science. It's a prophetic, and it's not something that you can, I don't dare to say, I see the sign of the times. I see the signs of times as a sociology. This is what sociology does. They try to see the sign of the times. But what does it mean for the mystery of salvation and for the history of humanity? We don't know. And the argument is, first, that as a sociologist, I'm very aware that the church can simply not change its position today and tomorrow every week according to whatever the fashions are. Those have to be only after, as I said, a consensus of the sacred values, of the new values have emerged. My point is that to gain this consensus, there is a possibility of systematic discussion of these issues within the church that gives the possibility of participation, everybody, in the formation of this consensus. There is no certainty. What I know is that we have 2 alternatives. Either we remain a Catholic church, open to the times, to the world, or we close ourselves into a sect of the pure, of those who really hold on to tradition, and become less and less relevant. Of course, we can hope that eventually, somehow, these mustard seeds will turn into, again, a new growing church. But I think that precisely given the global transformations, I think that it behooves the Catholic Church to remain open to this slope, precisely because it's not, we don't know in which direction history is going to go. There is no guarantee. We only have faith and hope that, again, the Spirit will always be guiding the Church, but we have no certainty. The Church has erred many times in history, but we have to a certain extent, be open to the possibility that we will err, but certainly we will err if we will not open ourselves to these conversations. And this goes back to how do we bridge the language? Well, again, as I mentioned, John Paul II calls for a new feminism. Well, I don't see any systematic attempt on the part of the Catholic Church to open up theological academies to discuss feminism, or to open up institutional sources of which kind of feminism can we present as alternative. When social Catholic doctrine emerged, it was first against liberal capitalism and against socialism. Both were bad, and what the church was to defend the old corporatist traditional culture and social forms. Eventually they engaged and tried to develop a third way between liberalism and socialism. My argument is we will only develop a feminism that indeed is a response to this feminism that we may find unacceptable if we engage seriously with them the same way that the Catholic Church engaged with capitalist movements and with socialist movements, with workers' movements and with all kinds of social movements, bringing also its own Catholic movements from below. But the Church has then to promote these Catholic movements from below. And so it has to be open to both that the new feminism emerges from the basis, and that the new feminism is, if you wish, institutionally promoted from the top. Without it, it will not happen. As to, this will be a very difficult question, the differences. I would be a bit careful about secular Europe, religious America, and let's look at Scandinavian societies. They may be very secular, but it appears to me there are more moral societies than many of our Christian societies or Catholic societies, certainly more than the United States. A very, very religious society, but I would say it has a lot of immoral, not only having to do with sexual morality, all kinds of things, from how many people we put in prison, the rates of crimes. All these things are not necessarily linked to modernity, because you have a lot of European societies that don't have the rates of anomie that we have in this country. They may be less religious, and people may not go to church, but they may have institutionalized precisely Christian principles in their politics, much better than we may have done in the United States. Italy, again, we cannot talk of Europe in general. Italy is very different from Spain. Spain is now as polarized as this country, but in the traditional sense of a Catholic Church and the laicist, Republican laicism. I think we have to look beyond Europe and the United States, be open up to the way in which those things develop also in non-Western contexts. I think that we can agree that the future of the church really lies in the non-Western world, and the question is which kind then of church emerges there, and whether it is a church that presents a new way of being modern, which is different from either the American or the European, or if it's only a transition, eventually they will follow on these issues, either the European or the American model. So in this respect, what we need is much more open and serious engagement as to, if you wish, the best practices everywhere, looking for what could be things from which we can learn when we talk of European socialism here in the United States. All the the so-called welfare states were established by Christian democratic parties after World War II. It was Christian democracy that came out of the Catholic social doctrine that precisely created the kind of solidarity, but also subsidiarity, which is the characteristic of many of those systems. So there was a much more engagement of Catholic social doctrine, and it still is. Even it's problematic when you have the European Union, and then you have a question who brings these debates, and in Brussels it's much more difficult, and the secularist position gains ground. But at the level of nations, it was Christian Democrats that brought the European Union together. It was a Christian democratic project, and many institutional arrangements were precisely established by social Christian democratic parties. So there was a different type of relationship to institutionalization of these principles in different European states.
So, Jose, we've touched on a lot of controversial topics. Somehow we managed not to mention tomorrow's election, which is refreshing. I suggest we now move on to the more informal conversation over the reception. I'd like to thank you all for coming out and ask you to join me in thanking Jose once again.